Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 30. Everything we have learned recently should bolster us against any surprise when I tell you that the Seleucid Empire was at its end. One could argue it was over already. Another contender for the final day of the empire, if a final day must be assigned, would be during the winter of 157 prior, in which the only large city under Seleucid control was taken by the Bosporans. This was Alexandria Prophthesia, once a thriving colony in which the Bactrians had a strong stake, and more recently a place where Persian and Bactrian had warred fruitlessly by Seleucid order. The infantry army of the east, under witness Aeneas, captured this place, while the Lithosis army of the late Pyrrhosides patrolled the region under their new steward, Elpenor, son of Darius. This patrolling was dutiful, since there were still armies in Bactria who might return to save the city in their charge. It would be a full year before anything of the sort would be attempted, and even then it would prove no cause for alarm, as we shall see. For now, I will only note that Elpenor remained a controversial commander, most of all because he believed that the Lithosis should not be employed for military work. This was because they were most strongly connected to the world through their lifelong observations of magic, and anything that diminished their numbers was tantamount to burning down a temple or shrine. This was the sort of thing that people who grew up in Chariskos tended to think. I can say little of its correctness, but I will at least concede the notion not impossible to fit into a sensible model of mankind's relation with the world. The salient point is that the army's level of military discipline and readiness plummeted, and therefore it is a good thing that the Seleucid remnants hardly cared for their duties in those fading days. Moving on to 156, the consolidation of Persia into the Bosporan Empire was well underway. King Darius was busy attempting to open the minds of the people to the truth of the world, and increasingly resorted to violence to check instances when it seemed unruly folk were going to do the same. He was aided though by the so-called Hekatompilos Cannon, the increasingly rich arm of the Scions of Gold operating to the north. They could provide places of learning and itinerant priests to begin opening the Persian people to their forgotten stewardship of worldly power. As for Prince Dion, he enjoyed parading around the Persian coast, making himself a key player in all manner of business ventures, since he was personally exceedingly wealthy. This ingratiated him with like-minded men doing the same all over Persia, Arabia, and even Indiki, and I would credit this friendly attitude towards anyone with coin enough to earn his attention as being part of why the region transitioned so quickly from war to peace. The nobles had something other to do than war and enjoyed the prospect. A notable move he made was to marry his daughter Iera to the king of the Nabateans in western Arabia, which secured lucrative trade routes from Hierosolyma to the Red Sea and beyond, along with many trained warriors to guard the region against anything that remained of the old Judean kingdom. No skirmishes with this group are on record since Dion marched out at the beginning of the First Bosporan-Seleucid War, although other accounts imply they still took place regularly up until the conclusion of the Second War. Truly, he had firmly established a personal domain across Palestine, with Tyre all but his own, and Hierosolyma practically built as his extensive estate. I think this was only tolerated because he was so well placed to dissuade the Ptolemies from jealousy, and equally well placed to force them away if they ever reneged on their alliance to the House of Spartacid. There will be more to say on his work there, as those who have made pilgrimage to the modern worship grounds will appreciate. The military business of the year was only brief, and occurred at its very close. For the whole period, 3 of Hyros's generals had prowled around Persia and Bactria, fleeing at the first sign that the Bosporan armies under Elpenor or Aeneas were nearby. This went on for months, until one of the generals found himself overrun by his pursuers. Bosporan men easily finished what the long period of poverty and exposure to the elements had begun, and went on to make good use of their deaths to energize the eastern cities with promises of new fertile grounds. I do not think the rituals were very successful because the Hecatompylians kept suggesting changes to the procedure. There are raging arguments about this today, of course, so I shall only report these rumors and move on. The rest of the Seleucid loyalists somehow held on until the summer of 155, effectively besieged in the open country since there was nowhere they could go to receive supplies or friendly treatment. When they dared approach Yazd to desperately beg for victuals, they were ambushed and destroyed by the well-relaxed and provisioned Bosporans. Hapless as the Seleukids were, this was more akin to herding slaves to market than a battle, and slavery was the most common fate of the defeated. Still, the last gasp of organized violence is what I consider the end of the war in Persia. If you like though, you might call Darius's treaty with the Arabian holdout the end, and I shall concede that in the formal sense it was. Although this all took place only days later, so the precise date is hardly different. To summarize this, Darius had journeyed the long and dangerous road from Mesopotamia into the heart of the Arabian desert. Most of the thinly spread people who lived there were world-worn nomads, to whom the affairs of armies and cities were like clouds passing by, to be noted and soon forgotten, for they always were to change and come again with utter certainty. I shall not argue they were wrong. However, there were strange but industrious people here who formed cities of their own, primarily concerning themselves with organizing caravans to and from the different coastal regions. The foremost city was named Zafar, and sheltered Horus's family. Therefore it sheltered whoever might be king now. No one agrees upon who of the dozens of scions present might actually have claimed this title. Darius came to this city, forced to move through herds of unusual-looking slaves to reach the den of his foe. He distributed coin to the local notables to ensure their support. No words had nearly so much effect, and so he wasted no time on utterances. Then he met with a group of at least 100 people who all claimed to be of the Seleukid house, who came practically as chattel under guard of 100 masked warriors in braided, jeweled protectives. It was again money that did all the work in this case. The Seleukids were purchased along with their officers, and Darius spent many days trying to organize the city so that it would not fall into chaos. This inevitably involved giving certain offices to the more successful of the Seleukid candidate branches, if that is what they truly were. Ultimately, some vestige of the empire remained, as a tightly held satrap of the Spartakids, defeated in all but name. The king received many envoys at Zafar, from warlords of the local region, and from kings of the distant and chaotic Lower Nile. All of these groups had no choice but to submit to whoever was master of Arabia, for the money of the cities and favour of the government officials was their lifeline there on the edge of the world. Hence Darius made treaties with so many other chiefs and leaders that his time in Arabia, no more than a month, made him king of territories that outdid pharaohs of thousand-year dynasties. And moreover, the people here were furtive in their uptake of tripartite truths, being in need of improvement to their lives more so than the Persians, and more in need of a wide-ranging authority to provide the training and materials for performing magic. This, I believe, contributed to the quick and peaceful conquest of this corner of the world in the aftermath of the wave of war that had lapped upon its shores. We are now very close to the end of the war for the Eastern world, so allow me to detail how its final blows came about. Quitting Arabia, the king travelled north to Armenia, gathering troops and mustering his allies along the way. King Ubalnu had been slain by his own confidant, an archon named Ara. This Ara faced a dire military challenge. He was besieged on all sides by either the Bosporans or those who had pledged to the Bosporans, with all attempts to shatter this union now falling on ears deafened by the trumpets of constant victories. The alliance came to Armenia now to coddle those trumpets again. When the snows melted in the year 154, the steppe peoples crossed the mountains to enter Armenia from the north. The Pergames of Asia made a coalition with the Pontics of Trapezus to deploy a lavishly equipped army from the west, and from the south came King Darius. Leading the king was Dion's man, Alcestis, who was only present to place down stakes on behalf of his master, the latter being busy with his work corralling the brigands of Mesopotamia to join his legions in Hierosolyma. Within 4 months, all Armenia was overrun, and territories were given away to whoever might have been there to contribute. All that remained was the eastern stronghold of Patakaran, an old mountain city with a fierce, rebellious population. This was where Archon Ara had found refuge, and his walls and depth of stores were such that he had scared most would-be attackers away. Then came the king. When Darius brought up catapults in the summer, Ara mustered his army and fled north to a secret fort in the mountains, appealing to a local spirit said to reside there. This spirit was called Pandora by Greek and Armenian alike, referring to the woman of old legend who we now know was actually Manos. The legend of her use of a box bringing the end of the world remains as a reminder that our ancestors once knew the Golden Age and lamented its ending, even if all the details have been corrupted by the loss of writing and the whispers of the gods being woven into human history as if it had always been that way. So, given that appealing to so-called Pandora and appealing to Manos held similar powers, it is no wonder that the long-preserved power of the mountain shrines was of genuine use to the Archon, which explains how he was able to return to the battlefield with such aplomb. First, he was challenged by warbands from the north. These were the descendants of the Alani peoples that the late King Spartacus had bound to the empire, now coming from their lands for the first time in a generation to make war again. And it went dismally. With effortless ease, Armenian troops brushed aside arrows like they were weightless wisps, and with wind-guided arrows of their own, they unhorsed anyone who came close to them. They hunted the Alani back to the mountain pass on the shores of the Hyrcanian Ocean, returning the bodies to the shrine of Pandora to regenerate their strength. It is said that a tree grew on the site of each man killed in those days of massacre. I have visited this place and found that trees and furthermore large rocks are common on the supposed trail, so that is quite consistent. Archon Ara came again from his shrine because the local people had been risen in rebellion by the promises of the king that they would be made free should they aid in achieving victory. Pater Karen had fallen bloodlessly, yet now the blood of its people was made to be spilled in the open field. Alcestis went out with the levied force and challenged for battle, receiving it so enthusiastically that, like in the case of the Alani, he was astounded and awed by his foe's prowess. Thousands were killed in the opening bouts of the day, and there was only terror and cries to escape on the lips of all. Alcestis himself was slain early in the affair, and it is said that not one single man escaped the field alive. Fortunately, the king himself had not gone to the field, staying behind with the main force to root out other smaller bands in the countless dells of that land. His success was spoiled entirely by the news of the disaster nearby. But when he heard of the shrine and the use of ancient magic, he went at once with his whole army to challenge for battle, completely fearless. Why was he so brazen in the face of this unprecedented menace? Because in the appeal of worldly worth and the love of the cosmic defectors who made us, Darius was by far the more pious and more proven, which gave him the coveted power of a true Golden Age king. It is only natural that a good king defeat a bad one, and if two leaders happen to be blessed by the oversight of the Creator, as Darius and Ara were, then the outcome of any confrontation will be the one that ordains to the natural order. As such, Darius simply walked his forces into battle, finding that his foes were beset by illness at his very approach. Archon Ara had degenerated into a muttering madness, and committed suicide on the altar of Pandora to try and relieve his pain. One might say he was successful in this. Hence the king captured the shrine and made sacrifice of his own camp animals to purify its alignment, and also for a second celebratory cause, to mark the end of the war. Armenia was subsumed into the Bosporan alliance, and there was now not a single legal way for one commander to be at war with another over a distance spanning from the northern extremities of the Black Forest in Europe to the brilliant yellow fields of the Persian coast. Yet, while this was celebrated in many places and praised endlessly at the time, writers from later times hardly mention this coming of peace in the same era-defining language. That is because they know what King Pyrrhosides had come to know and fear, that the world had only now been placed into the initial conditions for a war so vast and violent as that which caused the fall of humanity 3,000 years ago. Furthermore, the peace of the world as it stood was tenuous, because the world was still filled with people who did not want peace, with half men indeed. It was the task of the Scions of Gold to inform the masses of what a peaceful vision of the world would be like, and convince people not of what precisely a perfect king would be like, since that was easy enough to understand, but more simply that such a person can and would exist if only the principles laid out by the founding deities were adhered to. The principles of harmony, of faith in humanity, ignorance of avarice, in which the highest ranks can bow and follow the order of the lowest when they are true and righteous, and then when the lowest ranks follow the highest, it is with unlimited obedience paired with boundless skepticism, knowing that a single flaw in a single king is more than enough reason to seek replacement, yet no reason at all to spill blood over it. And it is kings more than anyone else who must obey this, to bring about the endless regenerating order of the first men, and indeed to replicate the society that lived on in the world's end forest for all those thousands of years, falling more gently than the rest of the world, and so preserving something of what our progenitors were like. It is simple enough that these words are all one really need to understand what they must do, yet to actually become like this in a world that is so different to the ideal is extraordinarily difficult. This too is something Pairisates had come to appreciate in his later years, advising slowness and caution for those alive today. But perhaps he underestimated the joy that connecting to ancient humanity can automatically engender in the heart of any good person, regardless of station or lineage. This was not enough for full appreciation of the truth to arise, but enough for gods and kings alike to have their ways questioned by hopeful sorts. This tends to be the birthing method for useful knowledge in all fields of life. In short, over the years that came next, the Scions of Gold found remarkable success in attracting audiences wherever they went, and soon enough they went everywhere they were allowed. I am forced to make this qualifier of allowed because in our tale we have principally concerned the right-hand side of the world. There is indeed a left-hand side, the side under the Roman millstone. The Romans had their own view of the cosmic world, and I shall describe it more later. First, we should lay out important discoveries that were made by the Bosporans and Scions of Gold in the years of peace we have been washed into by the flow of this chronicle. After the war, the Lithosis army had returned to the First Lands. The most veteran warriors had been all over the world over a period of some 30 years, and as a result had come to understand what they called the Realm of the Gods, that being the places outside of the First Lands as they defined it. And in gaining knowledge of all these gods, there had arisen disputes about their role in maintaining the afflictions of the half-men. Specifically, there was talk that certain gods seemed to help humanity, and others to hinder us. This is, as always was, the view of most half-men after all. The debate was on whether some of the cosmic gods were of the same mind as Manos, and wished that the world be preserved as a place of peace, apart from the cosmos. This is an easy argument to construct, because we know for a fact that Manos arose from the conditions of the cosmos, so there is no restriction on any number of other beneficent entities coming upon Manos's work and wishing to champion it. Some of the gods might be classified as such, however the act of classification here was too imprecise for a debate on the matter to be finite. The debates spread across the entire world, since it was only natural for people who had loved the gods for their whole life to try and reconcile the truth of the cosmos with the notion that their protectors and idols might be on humanity's side in this ancient, secret struggle. In fact, this notion, I would say, was essential in allowing people to hold their old views alongside the new, that being the official, if increasingly ludicrous, policy of the Bosporan courts high and low. Furthermore, I think the evidence we have today is more and more convincingly speaking of the truth in this arrangement. The instincts of those who knew the gods honestly and wholly is nothing to be ignored either. But that is only my view, of course, and there are other views available from every person in every agora, as you have no doubt found firsthand on your path to scholarship. Now, among those seeing that we have supporters among the gods was Prince Elpenor, who had come to reside at Chariskos after the war. He was still the nominal leader of the Empire's Lithosis soldiers, until of course in the autumn of 152 prior, in which he resigned his post amid hails of applause from his own men. He had taken it upon himself to discover whether the allies of humanity who reside now in the cosmos could be contacted, and for this, the Lithoses had convinced him the only course of investigation was to leave the world of the gods and go to the forest. Elpenor took little prompting, wanting this course for his own pleasure also. Thus, when King Doreus came to formally relieve the retiring Lithosis riders of their duties, he was forced to retire his own eldest son too. He did this with a sense of joy, all agree, because Doreus had also become intrigued by the topic of human-cosmic interaction, and had absolute faith in his son to achieve the goal he pursued. It was perhaps the faith he had wished his own father had given to him, and it is also a sign that each successive generation of House Spartakid was becoming less kingly in the old sense, and more kingly in the golden sense. In this way, a prince quitting his duties to follow some curious instinct was a natural delight. The king took over his son's role, attaching the newly formed army of recruits and younger veterans to himself, knowing that it would be needed. To that end, he began to move all the men he could bear to raise from east to west, towards the camps and forts his father had built in Old Dacia. The strand I was following through thickens with the knowledge that came to the Scions of Gold with the capitulation of the distant Kimbri coalition. I shall explain that to you now. This concerns the topic of whether our worldly activities can affect or touch the cosmos. The Romans, for example, had always believed this to be the case, and freely killed people they came across on the basis that the weight of life in the world was in some way to blame for the overall downfall of humanity. They had their reasons to embark on that horrid venture, but were not forthcoming in trying to convince the Bosporans of this, or I should say the leadership so strictly controlled access to knowledge that even local people had little chance of receiving it. Something similar could be said for the Kimbri, whose hatred of the Bosporans was driven by an ideological divide only explicable by deep-seated cosmic information. And that information was at last fully disclosed at the same time as the debates were going on in Kariskos over the course of 152. The way this came about can be credited to a princely father and son pair, Aristippus and Cineas. Since 160, these two had been touring the European forests, becoming familiar with their layout, and at last properly establishing roads and stables for commerce. This was not a peaceful affair, for the reason that the forests had become stuffed with refugees fleeing Roman madness, and indeed with headhunters and rogues who took advantage of this. Some of these refugee groups became so numerous and were so well organized that they were armies unto themselves, and through the fighting their banditry necessitated, both Aristippus and Cineas came into conflict with the Kimbri in 4 recorded cases. In each case, victory came easily, because the Kimbri were also besieged by the Romans from the west, and had few good warriors available. Therefore, Aristippus led the allied Germanians to crush northern strongholds, while Cineas came from the east along the coast of the world, travelling with Dunagol warriors he had raised during his customary tour of Lithosis lands upon his coming of age. I should note that Cineas was an extremely heroic-looking man, who affected women in a profound way with a mere glance. Therefore, it is indicative of his tastes that he chose to marry a ghostly Lithosis girl named Myandria, without his father's permission, let alone the king's. Aristippus, for his part, was not against this, but he was also of a rather liberal spirit, and had come to enjoy the company of unusual people such as Myandria and her gallivanting family group. In Cineas' own writings, there are claims that the Dunagol had recently constructed large settlements deep in the woods, and I hear rumours about these places even today. There is hard evidence too, because there are buildings in Germania that Cineas supposedly oversaw the construction of, which have unusual architectural flourishes. These are said to be of the style used in the private domain of the Western Lithosis. Once all our worldly business is done, I hope to investigate this matter in person. Returning from that aside, a few brief engagements saw rumours of Bosporan might turn quickly into terrifying fact for the Northerners, and their chiefs came forward to ask for peace. They received far more, as Aristippus was interested not only in peace but friendship. And so it was that, with a certain sense of disbelief, the war of decades-long pedigree was sealed away by written agreement. This agreement brought with it the Kimbri runestones, and that is what refreshed the understanding of the Scions of Gold, and indeed the world. The stones were copied and taken to Apollon. Aristippus kept the originals in Kysurgis so that he could permit Armenians to see them, and hence be exposed to copies of the Eastern stones, fostering unity of understanding in a dignified and comradely manner. The Scions of Gold were rather embarrassed by what they found. The stones contained information they had previously dismissed as forgeries when presented by enthusiastic Getae and travelling Greek mystics. This was information on the nature of the Paragon deities. In short, it stated that while Paragon deities had once been human, their extreme adherence to perfection in one aspect of their lifestyle or another had inflamed the power of Manos and Ymo that fuels all human life, and hence made them something more than human. This caused them to be unable to properly die, because their spirits could not be recycled to future generations, having been so changed by this internal kindling of brilliance. Therefore, when their years were spent, they did not return to the earth, rather they began to return to the cosmos. This, as you might have already noticed, is similar to what the Romans believed at the time. However, the Romans contended that all humans were doomed to a cosmic grave. The truth is that only those with paragonic characters possess this destiny. Another important distinction between Roman bluster and reality is the nature of the barrier between cosmos and world. While Romans would say that spirits are transferred to the outside, and hence shrink the total space allotted to our reality, the Kimbri knew that Paragons actually remained on the border because they are of neither world. We know that this is true because their presence is detectable in astronomical records. It has long been known that certain stars can only be seen in certain places, and that some stars have changed in position or intensity over centuries of observation. This can only be explained by the work of the immortal Paragon deities, whose activity on the border of the cosmos sometimes enlarges or shrinks the volume of cosmic power visible to us, and in turn the influence or even knowable existence of certain gods. Since you will be familiar with all this already, I shall not press the matter further. These discoveries had lain dormant in many frontier peoples who lacked the sophistication to ever measure and confirm their validity. This was solved quickly with the spread of this new truth through the academic establishments of Greece and Persia, and there was a delightful synergy of philosophies now, because the truth of material things and of magic seemed so obviously linked when the entire scene was established in wizened minds. It is here that modern knowledge of our cosmic engineering efforts began to first take shape, and almost immediately the so-called Golden Paradox was hit upon. To be a perfect citizen of Earth is to impregnate yourself with an inhuman energy which might curse you to be not human or god, seeing the boons of neither, and in fact draining the world of the slice of power you inherited from your less paragonic parents. If all mankind was to behave in perfect accordance with what our founders intended, would humankind thus be eliminated? It would be some time before that panic was overcome, and the opportunity it presented fully harnessed for the work that now takes place today. But that field of philosophy was only larval in the time I am charged with chronicling, so let us look to the more prominent matter people were talking about in the late 150s prior. This was the increasingly open ambition of Rome to carry on what you might call their own cosmic engineering effort, albeit one that came from a different and mistaken school of thought. This was the scheme under which the mass extermination of common people was required to reduce the world's population to a suitable size, such that the cycle of spirits from body to world would be restored, and no more stray spirits would be forced out to empower the cosmos. Supposedly this process would eventually destroy our world, and hence any act that contributed to halting it was above moral assessment. The people of Gallia, Iberia, Carthage, and plenty more had been culled to serve this holy quest, and only by the 150s was it obvious how little this had achieved. This restful moment of self-doubt revealed two courses to the Romans. One was to realize they had been fooled, and the other was to invent any reason they pleased to explain away their failings as the fault of others. Since Romans are not accustomed to making choices, they elected that they would follow both paths. Pyrrhosides knew this already when he was told of his daughter's suspicious death, because he had already received a letter from her saying that she had been enlisted in a conspiracy against the Caesar family. this conspiracy was in full flow by the time of her death, and while we have no information to use other than the falsified records of the Romans, it is highly likely that the business was the bringer of her demise. Was she responsible for the death of Sextus Caesar in Gallia, which some say happened around the same time? The Romans have ensured that no one can know. What we know certainly is that the Roman Senate, their ruling council in the capital, organized the killing of dictator Gaius Julius Caesar in 155 prior. This man was the driving force behind the campaigns of extermination and the foremost believer in the righteousness of this. What else could he feel, being so guilty of monstrous crimes? He was replaced by the traditional rotating series of temporary dictators, the so-called consuls, but this was done away with very quickly when the political tide turned towards ignoring Roman failings and invoking foreign ones. This allowed the famous Servius Gabinius Atellus to declare himself dictator with popular support in 151. Better known by his nickname the Faint in the east and his title the Judge in the west, he was to Carthage what Caesar had been to Gallia. In other words, he was the architect of a never-before-seen campaign of sacking and extermination, which he hated to witness in person, hence the Faint. His hatred for anything not Roman was severe, and his leadership was impeccable, causing the Roman people to become entrained to his excuses regarding the failing state of his empire. Those being that the Bosporan Empire was behind it all. And that is not entirely wrong. It is simply that his rationale was no more than mad rambling and hubristic blindness. He was convinced, and convincing, of the notion that Rome needed to be alone in the world to achieve the salvation of all. Or, to put it in starker, more honest terms, should it be required that all must die, they would die last. Since there was no hiding this intention from all peoples of the world, the lines in the sand were drawn now as inexorably as the late King Pyracades had feared. For King Dorius, presiding at Apollon in those days of 151 prior, it was a simple challenge with a simple solution. Kill one killer, spare 100 victims. With a scale that had never been seen before, because the rulers who were squaring off were in command of armies that drew their men and supplies from the entire world. It was a conflict for the very soul of our species, and this can be said with not a speck of poetic flourish. It was to affect everyone in pursuit and outcome, and there was due to be little about it that resembled any age of gold. But Dorius had already promised to overcome this prospect, come what may. And so I shall begin next to describe the enormous work that went into the new world war for our future, and how the blood began its course to the earth. Be not afraid, for if the Golden Age ended with such a war, it is not impossible that the Age of Half Men should end in this fashion too. To what end precisely shall be up to us.